The fence came down at 11:47 in the evening. Not with the sound of breaking, with the sound of precision. The wire parting cleanly, section by section, in the hands of a man who had done this before and intended to do it again. Each cut deliberate, each movement measured. Not urgency but confidence, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more dangerous. 5 men entered the Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve without triggering a single alarm. The first man through the gap was not careful. He was confident. There is a difference that matters. Careful men check their footing before they move. Confident men have already decided where they are going and move toward it with the economy of someone who has stopped believing the ground will betray them. He checked his GPS unit and confirmed coordinates and did not break stride. His name was Hobe Cram. He was 44 years old. He had operated in 12 countries under contracts that existed only in oral agreements and private servers, and he carried that history in the particular stillness of a man who has learned that the world does not surprise him anymore, only confirms what he already suspected. The others followed in silence. Behind Cram came Set Rain, 39, with the measured movements of someone who counts everything before committing to it. Rain was the kind of man who made other professionals comfortable, because he never moved faster than he understood, and never understood less than he needed to. Behind Rain came Glenn Vetch, carrying the communications package that allowed the team to speak on frequencies no scanner in the county could locate. Behind Vetch came Dwell Prin, the technical specialist, whose function would not begin until they reached a specific room in a specific building, and would end the moment he pressed a single key. Last through the cut wire was Tor Hen, 22 years old, who had never been inside a military installation before this night, and was moving with the studied deliberateness of someone trying not to appear afraid, which is its own kind of tell to anyone who knows what to look for. The temperature was 14 degrees below 0 Celsius, the kind of cold that arrives not as sensation but as pressure. The air pressing inward from all sides, probing the gaps between gear and training and discipline the way water probes a hull. In the Gallatin Range in December, it always finds at least one. Cram stopped beside the cut section of fence and looked back at it. He pulled a corner of burned signage from beneath his boot and turned it over in his gloved hand. The sign was solid steel and had been mounted on the fence post, and someone had burned it from the bottom before they arrived. Use of deadly force authorized. He read it. He dropped it in the snow. He had been briefed on the facility in full, on the standing orders, on the security infrastructure, and also on the one detail that made all of it manageable. The Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve had been officially closed for 4 years, its training mission transferred to another installation, and the only personnel remaining on site was a single civilian contractor, a range safety officer, grade GS9. Her job was to file maintenance logs that no one read, and to ensure that the physical infrastructure of the reserve did not deteriorate faster than the budget allowed. He tapped his earpiece twice. The column held still. "Bunker C," he said, "Northwest Quadrant, in and out by 0400. No one responded. They moved. She had been watching them for 11 minutes before the fence came down. Orla Wyne was lying in a depression in the frozen earth at the base of Observation Tower Alpha, inside a hide she had constructed 3 weeks earlier from materials available on the reserve. The hide was not visible from the ground at distances greater than 4 meters. She knew this because she had tested it herself, approaching from 12 different angles over 2 days, walking slowly, letting her eyes work the way trained eyes work, looking for the shapes and textures that do not belong. She had not been able to find it. She had been satisfied. She was 27 years old. Her official title was Civilian Range Safety Officer, grade GS9, assigned to the Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve under a contract that renewed annually, and paid slightly less than what she spent each month on rifle ammunition. Her unofficial designation was the one she had been given during her second deployment, by a team sergeant who had watched her hold a static position for 19 hours in a mountain pass in Paksha province without moving, without eating, without making any sound at all. He had called her the most patient person he had ever encountered. He had not meant it as a compliment. She had taken it as one, because patience at that level is not a personality trait. It is a weapon. The M2010 extended-range sniper rifle was across her body, barrel directed left, muzzle discipline maintained even in the hide, even in darkness, even with no one to see it. She did not raise it. At 200 meters she could read the posture of every man who had come through that fence, and posture told her the things she needed to know before anything else. These were not thieves. Thieves move with their heads down and their eyes sideways. These men moved with their heads up and their eyes forward. They were going somewhere specific, and they already knew where it was. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She noted the communications package on the third man. She noted the equipment bag carried by the fourth. She noted the youngest one, the last one through the wire, who had paused for exactly 2 seconds before stepping through the gap, and who had then forced himself not to pause again, overriding the hesitation with something that looked like resolve but was actually instruction. He had been taught to push through that pause. He had not yet taught himself to stop having it. She had a satellite phone in her left cargo pocket. There was a number stored in it that she had dialed 9 times over the past month. The line rang 4 times and connected to voicemail on each occasion. She did not dial it now. She already knew the outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Parnwelk had been dead for 8 months. The dead do not answer their phones, and she had understood for the past 6 of those months that calling his number was not really about reaching him. It was about the 2 seconds of ringing before the voicemail picked up, when the line was open, and something in her still believed that this time would be different. She put the phone away. The wind came down from the northwest off the peaks, crossed the reserve's 6 shooting lanes, and found the automated target infrastructure on Lane 3. It produced a low tone against the cable housings, something between a note and a moan, the sound of metal holding against something larger than itself. She had spent 4 years cataloging the sounds this place made. She knew the sounds of the wind against the range equipment, and the sounds the old structures made when the temperature dropped and the metal contracted and the bolts shifted in their housings. She knew the sounds of the animals that had moved in after the humans moved out. She knew the difference between a sound that belonged to this place and a sound that did not. The sound of 5 trained men moving across frozen ground in darkness did not belong. She raised the M2010, not to fire, to see. Through the thermal scope, the 5 men appeared as bright shapes against the cold, each one distinct, each one expressing a different heat signature based on metabolic rate and physical condition, and the particular chemistry of how their bodies were responding to the cold and the stress of the operation. The team leader ran hotter than the others. He had either been awake longer or he was operating at higher arousal, or both, which in her experience were usually the same condition. She tracked him for 40 seconds, and then moved back to the youngest one at the rear of the column. He was walking too carefully. That was the specific tell. Experienced men in unfamiliar terrain adopt a slightly loose gait, weight balanced forward, knees soft, the body prepared to absorb the unexpected. This one was walking like a man afraid of making noise, which was what he had been trained to do but had not yet internalized, so it showed in the mechanics of how he placed each boot before committing his weight to it. Training and instinct are different things. Training without instinct produces a specific quality of movement that she had learned to identify the way a doctor learns to recognize a particular kind of gait before a diagnosis has been made. She noted it, filed it, moved on. She let them go and turned to the next necessary thing. The frequency scan took 4 minutes. She used a device no larger than a field notebook, procured through a channel that Parnwelk had arranged in the final months of his tenure, and that she had never asked him to document, because they both understood that documentation was the wrong kind of record for this kind of equipment. What the device returned in those 4 minutes was more information than the men crossing the reserve would have been comfortable providing. The map loaded in their GPS units was classified. She had to read that line 3 times before she allowed herself to absorb it. The map of the Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve, loaded into the navigation systems of these 5 men, was a document that did not appear in public records requests. It was the kind of document that existed in precisely 6 locations: the JSOC Facility Management Office, Installation Command at Fort Liberty, the Pentagon Archives Division, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Restricted Holdings, and 2 issued copies assigned to named individuals whose clearances permitted them to hold physical versions of documents at this classification level. 6 copies total. One of them had moved. She pressed the back of her head against the frozen earth and looked up at the sky. The stars over the Gallatin Range were not like the stars anywhere else she had ever been. They were too numerous and too close, the way distance collapses when there is nothing between you and the thing you are looking at for 100 miles in any direction. She had disliked this sky when she first arrived. It was too much, too present. She had come to need it. She held that information a moment and let the shape of it settle. Classified map. 6 possible sources. She did not follow that thread further tonight. Tonight there was a more immediate problem. She took out the green field notebook from inside her jacket. She had found it 7 months ago, in the days immediately following Welk's letter arriving, driving to this reserve alone, and spending the better part of an afternoon on her knees in the frozen earth, near this exact support beam, before her gloved hands closed on the sealed bag. Parnwelk had told her exactly where to look in a letter he sent 14 days before he died. The letter had arrived 3 weeks after his funeral. She had stood in the parking lot of the post office holding it, reading it twice, folding it carefully, and sitting in her truck for 20 minutes before she was ready to drive. She did not open the notebook. She had memorized the first page in the first hour after reading it. What she needed right now was the weight of it in her hands. She put it back inside her jacket, against her sternum, where the warmth from her body would keep the pages from going brittle. Then she moved. The automated target infrastructure of the Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve had been designed so that a single range safety officer could run full precision training exercises without requiring anyone to go downrange. 6 shooting lanes extending to 1,800 meters. Each lane carried steel target plates on a cable pulley system running the full length of the range. The cable operated electrically from the range control building, but each lane also had manual junction boxes positioned at intervals along its length, accessible without going to the control building, accessible to someone who knew where they were. She knew where all of them were. She did not run. She moved at the pace she had been trained to move at in close proximity to alert personnel. Not slow, not fast, steady, with a specific controlled quality in the shoulders that prevented the upper body from generating visual noise in peripheral vision. The junction box on lane 2 was at the 300-meter mark. She reached it at 12:31 in the morning. The box on lane 4 was at the 450-meter mark. She reached it at 12:34. The box on lane 6 was positioned at 220 meters from the camp's current position. She reached it at 12:39. At 12:41 she activated the first cable. The sound it made was not loud. It did not need to be. At 14 below zero, Sound moved differently than it did in warmth. It traveled farther, sustained longer, took on the qualities of the surface it moved across. When the steel target played at the 800-meter position on lane 2 shifted on its cable in the darkness, the cable housing at 200 meters produced a sound, not like metal against metal, like a footstep. Like a man walking on frozen ground with deliberate, unhurried intent. Someone who knew exactly where he was and was taking his time getting there. She activated lane 4, then lane 6. For the next 40 minutes, the darkness surrounding the 5 men's camp contained movement that had no visible source. The sounds arrived from different directions, at different distances, in sequences that implied a pattern without completing one. She watched through the thermal scope from 180 meters and observed the response of trained men to a stimulus they could not locate. 2 of them took immediate defensive positions, covering the approach angles from which the sounds were coming. Cram stood at the center of the camp with his weapon raised, rotating slowly, systematic. The youngest one pressed himself against his pack and did not move. Set Rain said something. She could read the cadence without hearing the words. Cram responded. The response was dismissive, the movement of his head and hands suggesting refusal without consideration, the posture of a man who has made a decision about the situation and does not require input. Whatever Rain had proposed, Cram had rejected it. She held position and watched. At 1:17 in the morning, Cram lowered his hand and the 2 men in defensive position stood down. He kept his own weapon across his body and continued scanning. His head moved in the pattern she recognized from men who had spent extended time in environments where the threat existed before it was visible. He was not afraid. He was recalibrating. There is a meaningful distinction. Afraid men become reactive. Recalibrating men go still and think forward. He was thinking. She pulled back from her observation position and began the careful movement back toward the hide before first light found the range. She had been lying in the cold for 2 hours and 40 minutes when the memory of coast came for her. It always came without invitation and without warning. That was the nature of things that had been sealed rather than resolved, and she understood this about herself well enough to let the memory come when it came and to wait without fighting it until it passed. The checkpoint was outside coast in the spring of 2022. She had been deployed as part of a joint intelligence coordination element, and the night had started as routine nights at routine checkpoints often started, which meant it started quietly in a way that turned out to be misleading. She was on an elevated position north of the checkpoint wire when she heard the sound of metal being cut. In the green light of her night observation device, she had watched 3 men come through the wire from the western approach. They wore no uniform she recognized. The man coming from the eastern approach was named Aram Das. He was an interpreter and intelligence liaison who had worked with coalition forces in the coast region for 7 years. She knew his face from the intelligence brief she had read that morning. He was holding a sheaf of documents against his chest with both arms, the way a man holds something he cannot afford to drop. She raised her rifle. She acquired the first man through the western wire. Her finger rested at the trigger guard, the position that means ready without meaning fire. She pressed her earpiece and reported contact. 3 unidentified men from the west, 1 confirmed intelligence source approaching from the east, and she requested authority to engage. The response came in 4 seconds. Stand down, Wyne. She held her position. She held her eye to the scope. She watched the 3 men reach Aram Das at 40 meters from the checkpoint wire. She watched what happened next. She watched it for 17 seconds and then she looked away. She had not forgiven herself for looking away. Not completely. Not in 3 years. But the thing that had happened at that checkpoint had happened regardless of where she had been looking, and she had been ordered to stand down, and she had stood down, and her file had been sealed 48 hours later, and she had understood from that moment what her silence was worth to certain people, and what the silence of Aram Das had been worth to certain other people. She came back to the present the way she always came back from that memory, not all at once, gradually, the way someone rises from cold water by letting the surface come to them rather than pushing toward it. She was lying in the frozen earth. The stars were above her. The range was quiet. The 5 men were 400 meters to the northwest in their camp, some of them sleeping, some of them not. She breathed out slow and controlled. "Not this time," she said. The words were barely sound. They did not carry beyond the space around her face. But she had said them, and saying them was what mattered, and she felt the familiar settling in her chest that came after, the way a rope goes taut when you have finally taken hold of something fixed. She checked the thermal scope. All 5 signatures held their positions. She committed each location to memory at the level that goes beyond conscious record, the level that becomes available in the dark without asking, and then she turned her attention back to the one thing she still needed to understand. The classified map, 6 sources. She ran through them the way she ran through everything methodically without allowing the list to generate emotion before she had finished it. JSOC Facility Management, Installation Command at Fort Liberty, Pentagon Archives, NGA Restricted Holdings, 2 issued copies. She knew one of the issued copies had been Parn Welk's, now inside her jacket. The 6th copy was with someone who was still alive, and who had chosen to hand it to the men currently sleeping in the northwest quadrant of her range. She did not know who that person was yet. She would need to know before this was over. The intercept came at 1:56 in the morning, a radio transmission from inside the camp directed outward beyond the reserve's perimeter to a position she could not see. The transmission was encrypted and compressed. 11 seconds. Cram's voice, reduced to its functional components by the compression algorithm, but still identifiable by cadence and pace. She ran the intercept against the device's decryption protocols. Most of it was beyond the device's capacity to resolve. One word resolved fully. Bunker. She did not move for 30 seconds after that. Then she pressed her eyes closed briefly and let the full shape of it settle into place. Bunker C was in the northwest quadrant of the reserve. It was a hardened storage structure built in 1987 to hold the ballistics data generated during the reserve's operational years. Climate-controlled, reinforced, logged access only. The records inside covered 3 decades of precision shooting data, equipment performance reports, environmental condition studies, administrative material mostly, useful to researchers and historians and no one else. Except for what Parn Welk had placed inside it. 11 days before he died, Welk had driven to this reserve and spent 6 hours in Bunker C. The facility access log showed his clearance card used at 09:14 and again at 15:37 when he departed. The log did not record what he carried in or what remained when he left. Access logs do not capture that level of detail. She knew what he had left behind. She had not gone to retrieve it yet. She had been waiting to understand why he had chosen this location, this building, this reserve. She was beginning to understand now. These men had come to find it, and they had come to make sure that whatever Parn Welk had placed inside Bunker C did not survive long enough to be found by anyone else. She lay very still in the frozen earth. She thought about Parn Welk, who had been meticulous in the field and meticulous in his paperwork and meticulous in the way he arranged for the things that mattered most to outlast his own presence. She thought about the letter that had arrived 3 weeks after his funeral. She thought about the way he had written her name at the top of it, not her rank, not her title, just her name, which was the way he had always addressed her in private, because he believed that the name someone was given before the military got hold of them was the truest version of who they were. She thought about the first page of the notebook, the single paragraph she had memorized in the first hour after reading it. She had not opened the notebook since. The first page was enough for now. The first page told her what she needed to protect and why and for whom. The for whom part was what she needed to remember when the rest of it became difficult. She moved to a new angle of observation. Dawn came the way it always came over the Gallatin Range, not as an event but as a process. The light did not arrive so much as appear, finding the gaps between peaks and spreading out across the reserve's white surface in thin diagonals that made the ground look like a map of itself. She had watched this happen every morning for 4 years. She had never once stopped noticing it. She was not the kind of person who stopped noticing the things that first made an impression on her, and this sky, on her first morning at this post, had made an impression she still carried. She was back in her hide when she saw Torhen move. It was 4:29 in the morning. Most of the camp was still. Cram was up, which she had expected. Rain was up. The others were sleeping or near to it. Torhen had been lying on his back staring at the sky for at least an hour, which she knew because she had kept intermittent observation on him throughout the early morning. Something about him was unresolved in a way that the others were not. He got up. He moved to the northern edge of the camp's perimeter, not far, 30 meters from where his pack was resting, and he stopped. He had a small flashlight with a red filter. He pointed it at the ground, at the mud near the base of Observation Tower Alpha's northeast support beam. She went entirely still. Her boot print was in the frozen earth near that support. She had been there 3 nights ago when the ground was still soft enough to receive an impression, and had since frozen solid, the edges crisp, the tread pattern of her modified boot preserved in the soil with the clarity of something cast rather than left accidentally. She had calculated the risk of that print and had accepted it. She had not anticipated that it would be found in the dark by someone with a red-filtered flashlight at 4:29 in the morning. Torhen crouched beside the print. He studied it. He took out his phone and photographed it from 2 angles. He stood. He turned and looked at the darkness surrounding the camp in all directions. His scan was slower than Cram's. It had a different quality to it. Cram's scanning was tactical, looking for the shape of a threat. This was something else. This was the look of a young man who had just realized that the ground around him had already been read by someone who understood it better than he did, and who was beginning to understand what that meant. He typed a message, he sent it. Across the camp, she watched Cram's thermal signature shift. She watched him look at his phone. She watched him read. She watched him read it again. She watched him go very still. Then she watched him smile. Not a surprised smile. Not the smile of a man receiving unexpected information. The smile of a man receiving confirmation. As if the small boot print in the frozen earth near the tower support was not a complication in the operation, but was instead the specific thing he had been hoping to find. As if her presence here, alone, in the dark, watching them, was not a threat to what they had come to do. As if it was exactly what he had been waiting for. She held the scope on Hobe Cram's thermal signature and let that information move through her without reacting to it. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. The smile of a man who was not afraid of her, who was, in some precise and deliberate way, glad that she was here. That was not the response of a man who believed she was only a range safety officer. He knew something about her that she had not yet figured out, and whatever he knew, it had not made him cautious. It had made him pleased. She held that thought. She held it the way you hold a round you are not yet ready to chamber, carefully, without letting it go. The light over the Gallatin peaks was changing in the east. The cold was not lifting because the cold would not lift today, but the darkness was. She could see the fence line now, the gap where they had come through, the burned signage in the snow beside the post. She pulled out the satellite phone. She dialed the number she had dialed 9 times before. 4 rings. Then the voicemail. Then Parn Welk's voice, recorded 5 months before his death, unhurried the way a man gets unhurried when he has made a decision about how to spend the time he has left. She waited for the tone. "It's Orla," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "They are here, 5 of them. They have your map, which means someone gave it to them. They are going for Bunker C." She paused. Cram smiled when he found my print. He knew I was here. He was not concerned. She let a moment pass. "I don't know yet what he knows about me, but I am going to find out." She breathed in slowly through her nose. "I am going to protect what you left in there, whatever it costs. I need you to know that." She ended the call. She put the phone away. 50 meters to the northwest, a hawk with broad pale wings dropped from the upper frame of Observation Tower Alpha in a controlled fall, banking hard at the last possible moment, and pulling up just above the frozen ground before climbing back into the pale gray sky. She watched it go until it was a shape, and then nothing. A great many things lived in this reserve that no one in any office had accounted for. The government had closed the range and stopped paying attention to it, and in the absence of attention, things had moved in and settled and made the place their own. She understood that impulse completely. She checked the M2010. She had not fired it tonight. She had not needed to, but she checked it anyway the way she always checked it, each step in the sequence, thorough and unhurried, because the only thing worse than needing a weapon is needing it and finding it wanting. Bore clean. Scope protected. Stock solid. She ran her thumb along the place on the receiver where someone before her had removed the serial number, a small erasure whose history Welk had never explained. She had never pressed him on it. Some things you hold without opening. Across the range, the camp was beginning to stir. Rain was on his feet. Cram was already moving. The 2 she had not yet identified by name were sitting up. Tor Hen, who had not slept, was sitting with his back against his pack, facing east, facing the direction the light was coming from. She counted the hours between now and the next night. 18 hours, roughly. She had been patient for 3 years. She could be patient for 18 hours. Tonight, she would activate more of the cables. Tonight, the sounds would come from directions they had not come from before, at distances that did not make sense, in combinations that would give Set Rain another reason to push for something Hobe Cram was not yet willing to give him. And sometime in those 18 hours, she would go to Bunker C and take what Welk had left there before they had a chance to find it and destroy it. And she would begin to understand why a professional with Cram's history had smiled when he found her print in the frozen ground. Whatever the answer was, it connected to Coast. It connected to Aram Das. It connected to the sealed section of a service record that had been locked behind a clearance level she was not supposed to have and had never been officially told existed. She had been patient about that too. She had been patient long enough. She settled back into the hide. She pulled the field notebook from inside her jacket and held it against her chest, not opening it, just holding it, feeling the weight of what Parn Welk had trusted her to carry. Outside the hide, the light was growing. The mountains were coming back into shape against a sky that was moving from black to the particular gray that preceded color in this part of the world. In the camp 400 meters away, Hobe Cram stood looking in her direction. He could not see her. She was certain of that. But he was looking, which meant he was thinking, and whatever he was thinking was connected to the smile she had watched move across his face at 4:29 in the morning, when a 22-year-old with a red filtered flashlight had sent him a photograph of a small boot print in the frozen earth. She did not look away. She watched him watching the place where she was not visible. She had been doing this for 4 years, watching this range, listening to it, learning every frequency it used and every sound it made and every shadow it cast at every hour. She had not done this because she was told to. She had done it because Parnwelk had asked her to, and because she had understood from the tone of his letter that what he was asking her to protect was not a building or a set of records. It was the answer to why 4 men were dead. And that was worth every cold hour and every sleepless night, and everything else this was going to cost before it was finished. She was ready for tonight. She had been ready for longer than tonight. The camp did not break at dawn. She had expected some movement toward the northwest, toward Bunker C, where the men had come to go. Instead, the camp held through the full light of the second morning, and she lay in the hide and watched it hold. Cram moved the perimeter from 6:30 to 7:20 in the methodical way of a man conducting an assessment rather than a search. 40 meters out, then 60, in overlapping arcs, his thermal signature a steady and deliberate warmth against the cold ground. He stopped 3 times at the positions where she had activated the junction boxes the night before. He crouched beside each one. He stood. He noted whatever he noted. She was watching him learn the range. This was information she had not fully anticipated. That a man with his background would, instead of retreating from a situation he could not control, choose to understand it. She had counted on trained men moving under uncertainty toward the familiar responses of force or withdrawal. Cram had done neither. He had gone still and read the environment the way she would have read it, and that told her something about him that the thermal scope alone could not. He was not here only for Bunker C, or rather, Bunker C was the stated objective, but Cram was interested in something else in the space between the objective and the complications. He was interested in her. She had a DIA contact number in the field notebook, written in Welk's hand on the 7th page, under a date from 3 years ago. She had looked at the number 6 times over the past 7 months and had not called it. The reason was not distrust of the contact itself. The reason was the classified map. Whoever had provided these 5 men with a map that existed in only 6 copies was someone with access to channels inside the intelligence community at a level that made broad calls for help inadvisable until she knew who was listening. She needed the Bunker C materials before she called anyone. She needed what Welk had built, the documented, sealed, chain of custody evidence that would make it impossible for any single individual in any position of authority to make the problem disappear by reassigning it. Personal testimony was not enough. It had not been enough 3 years ago. What Welk had understood was that the only proof capable of surviving the kind of pressure certain people could apply was proof that required the documented destruction of a physical object stored inside a federal facility with an access log. 1 more night, maybe 2, then she would have what she needed. She spent the daylight hours of the second day preparing. She left the reserve at 9:40 through the maintenance gate on the southern perimeter, the one that appeared in no map but her own. She drove 40 minutes to the closest town with a public library. She printed 3 photographs from a memory card she had been carrying for 7 months, the same card she had brought from a storage unit in Colorado when she accepted this posting. The photographs were not old. She had taken them that morning before leaving the hide, through a long-range camera from her elevated position near Tower Alpha, images of Hobe Cram's face in the pale December light at 300 meters, clear enough to read the features, clear enough that the person who had taken them could not be mistaken for someone who had done so accidentally. She wrote the same message on 3 separate pieces of white cardstock with a grease pencil. KHOSD 2022. She put the photographs and the cards in 3 waterproof sleeves. She was back at the reserve by 1400. 4 hours before dark. The infrared sensors were the size of a thumb drive, procured through the same channel that had produced the frequency scanner, calibrated to pulse in the wavelength range that appeared in night vision optics as a sourceless flare at the outer edge of perception. She had 8 of them. She placed the first 4 during the afternoon of the second day, moving between her position and the camp's northern exposure in the hour that the camp was most still, afternoon when the cold pressed everything into brief inactivity. She placed them at ankle height, facing inward, each one anchored to a stake with a short length of black paracord, each one set to pulse every 11 seconds, not constantly, not in a predictable rhythm. 11 seconds is long enough that a man can almost convince himself the previous flare was an equipment anomaly. Then it happens again. Then again. The phenomenon that is consistent and repeatable but cannot be located is the kind of thing that exhausts the analytical mind until the analytical mind begins to make errors. She placed 2 more sensors in the late afternoon, 6 total by the time the light was going. The last 2 she would place on night 3. The second night was different from the first, and she had known it would be. She activated the cable systems at 22:30, the same lanes as the night before but in a different sequence, delayed intervals between activations, so that the sounds came in pairs rather than threes, then silence for 7 minutes, then again from a single lane at maximum distance. Pattern without repetition. The appearance of intent without the confirmation of it. The camp's response was more controlled this time. They had adapted. Cram had established a 2-man watch rotation with sector coverage mapped. No one took a defensive position that left another sector uncovered. She noted the improvement and gave it the weight it deserved. Adaptive men were more dangerous than afraid men. They were also, in certain circumstances, more fragile, because adaptation requires a theory of the threat, and a theory that turns out to be wrong is more destabilizing than no theory at all. She gave them 2 hours to adapt. Then she moved. At 22:47, she covered 60 meters in 4 minutes and 40 seconds, staying below the ridge of scrub growth on the camp's western edge, using the cable sounds from lane 3 as her movement cover. The photographs were in 3 sleeves inside her jacket. She placed the first at the edge of the firelight, propped against a rock at the camp perimeter, visible from the camp's center in a way that suggested it had been there for some time and had simply not been seen. The second she left at the camp's eastern approach marker, the flat stone Cram used as a reference point for his perimeter walks. The third she placed at the base of the supply rack, face down, so that whoever turned it over would do so deliberately and alone. She was back at her observation position in 11 minutes. She waited. Vetch found the first photograph at 23:19. He picked it up and looked at it for 3 seconds, and then he looked around the camp perimeter in every direction. She watched him carry the photograph to Cram without looking at it again. Cram looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. He looked at the message on the card behind it. He did not change his posture. He did not look around the camp. He stood exactly as he had been standing and looked at the card for a long time, and she could not see his face at this distance, but she could see, from the stillness of the rest of him, that something had arrived that he had known was coming and had perhaps even expected, and had not fully prepared himself for nonetheless. He found the second photograph at the stone marker on his next perimeter walk. He did not call out to the team when he found it. He picked it up and looked at the message and placed it inside his jacket. The third photograph he found at the supply rack at 23:49. She watched him look at that one the longest. She watched him turn it over twice, study the image, and read the message again. Then he placed it inside his jacket alongside the others. He stood with his back to the camp and looked out at the range. What she had sent him was not a threat. What she had sent him was a statement of knowledge. She knew who he was. She knew where he had been in the spring of 2022. She knew what had happened there in a way that only someone who had been present or been briefed by someone present could know. She did not know yet what he knew about her that had made him smile when he found her boot print. But the photographs had told him something. She could see it in the way he stood for the next 6 minutes without moving or calling to the team or looking around him. A man standing inside a recalculation. The camp went quiet after that. No argument, no orders. The watch rotation continued, but the character of it had changed. The men who had been alert before were now alert in a different key. The quality of men in a situation that has changed in a way that cannot be changed back. She marked it and moved on. At 1:17, she used the M2010 for the first time in 4 years. She was 120 meters from the main cable junction on lane 3 and 740 meters from the camp's center pole, the single aluminum tube that supported the crossbar from which the camp's main shelter stretched. She had identified it through the scope on the first night and had not forgotten its position. She had set the card at the base of that pole during the afternoon, when the camp was empty for 26 minutes while Cram ran a longer perimeter arc than usual. The card was laminated and waterproof and held in place by the base of the pole itself, set at a slight angle where it would be visible when the pole was lifted or the collapsed material cleared. She settled into the prepared firing position, a low depression in the ground behind the junction box housing, prone, the M2010 on the bipod, the scope dialed for the distance, and the cold and the consistent crosswind she had been tracking since midnight. She breathed out until the breath was gone and the body was still, and the reticle was on the aluminum tube where it met the crossbar fitting. The trigger broke clean. 740 meters away, the support poles separated at the crossbar fitting in a single clean moment, and the shelter dropped in the specific way of canvas losing its skeleton, not explosively but in a controlled and quiet deflation, the edges settling to the ground in 4 seconds, the camp center becoming a low mound of collapsed material. The sound reached her half a second after the collapse, not loud. At this distance in this cold, the sound of the shot and the impact arrived separated enough that neither one sounded exactly like what it was. She watched through the scope as the team responded, efficient, no panic. Cram moved to the center of the camp, Vetch and Prin on the perimeter, Rain and Tor at the collapsed material, pulling back the sides. Rain found the card when he lifted the section of canvas closest to the former center pole. She watched him crouch beside it. She watched him read it. She watched him carry it to Cram. She watched Cram read it. Your turn. She could not see his expression. She could see his hands. He held the card in both hands for a moment before he placed it in the same pocket as the photographs. Rain said something. Cram shook his head. Rain turned and looked at the dark and the range and the lanes, and his posture had none of the studied calm he had maintained through the disagreement she had observed on the first night. He was standing with the particular quality of a man whose calculation has run its course and arrived at a number he did not put in. Whatever Set Rain had told himself about this operation when it began, he had stopped telling it to himself sometime in the previous 12 hours. Rain moved to where Cram was standing. He spoke. She read the cadence clearly across the thermal scope. He was not asking. He was stating. The specific posture she had been watching evolve over 2 nights had arrived at its conclusion. Cram did not respond immediately. He held the card in one hand. He looked at the range. He said something brief. Then he turned and began organizing the shelter repair, and Rain stood for a moment watching him before turning to help. She noted the quality of that pause, not compliance but a decision to wait. Rain had chosen timing, not surrender. He was not done. She scouted Bunker C in the early afternoon of the third day. The structure sat in a hillside recess in the northwest quadrant, 40 meters beyond the boundary of Lane 2. Hardened container, climate-controlled, reinforced frame, cipher lock on the access door. The code was in the facility management record she had retrieved 7 months ago, in the days after she understood what Welk had placed inside and what she would need to do to protect it. The monofilament was new. Clear plastic line, strung across the interior of the door frame at ankle height. The anchor on the left side was a small eyelet screw set into the frame's edge, with the kind of care that suggested someone who had done this before and knew what held. She crouched and studied both anchor points without touching the line. Then she checked the door's exterior and found the secondary indicator, a micromagnetized dust marker on the door seal, the kind that registers displacement when the door moves beyond its normal resting position. Someone from the camp had been here after the fence went down on night 1. She fixed both alarm points precisely in memory, marked their exact positions the way she marked distances and wind readings, and walked back to the range without entering the building. Tonight she would enter. She began night 3 with everything she had. All 6 cable systems, all 8 infrared sensors, the lanes activated in a sequence she had not used before, 3 lanes simultaneously, a 30-second gap, then 2 more, then a gap, then the final lane at maximum distance, cycling through without repetition. The effect was not of a single operator working a plan. It was the effect of a perimeter with more dimensions than 5 men could cover, distributed, sourceless, everywhere at once. She gave it 40 minutes. Then she moved. The Bunker C approach took 9 minutes along the drainage cut on the western edge of Lane 2, staying below the scrub line, using the junction box housing for cover at the midpoint. The camp was audible from here in the specific way that voices become audible when their sources have multiplied past the point of localization. The team had stopped trying to determine which direction the sounds were coming from because there was no single direction. She could hear in the quality of the camp's stillness that they had moved from active response to held position. That was the window she needed. She reached the Bunker C door. She stepped over the monofilament at the exact angle and height she had memorized. She pressed the cipher code. The lock disengaged. She pulled the door open in a controlled arc, staying within the range of movement that would not disturb the magnetic marker on the seal. Inside, the hum of the climate control unit, the smell of sealed air and metal. She clicked on the red filtered light and moved to the back wall of the container. The floor panel was in the far right corner. Welk's letter had told her. Behind the secondary rack, third panel from the wall, 2 Phillips screws backed out 3/4 of a turn but still in the threading so the panel looked secured. She found it exactly as he had described. She lifted it. Inside the recess, a waterproof case the size of a hardcover book, sealed with a compression clip. She opened it. A data drive, encrypted, sealed in an anti-static sleeve. Beneath it, a sealed envelope. White, not manila. Her name on the outside in Welk's backward-slanting handwriting, which she had known since the first letter he had written her when she was a corporal who had done something that landed her in front of his desk and who had expected a reprimand, and had instead received a recommendation for advanced training. She held the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was 4 pages, single-spaced in Welk's handwriting throughout. No typed sections. No covering bureaucratic language. He had written it the way he wrote everything in private, directly, without ornament, with the authority of a man who had nothing left to manage and was speaking into the record for the last time. The MT-7 batch was a precision ammunition contract awarded to Meridian Ridge Systems, in 2017. The certified performance data submitted by Meridian Ridge Systems in 2018 had been generated under conditions that did not match the conditions under which the ammunition would be used. The temperature variance, the altitude, the bore temperature protocols used in Meridian's testing. None of them were the protocols applicable to field use in environments like Helmand Province in summer operational conditions. She understood what she was reading. She kept reading. 4 men, not named in the certification failure report that had been filed internally, named in the 4 separate engagement incident reports that Welk had pulled from the JSOC after-action archive, cross-referenced with the performance window of the MT7 batch, and connected to the failure data he had commissioned from an independent ballistics laboratory through a chain of custody that no one inside the relevant command structure had been watching. SFC Devon Mace, SSG Lyle Crown, SFC Emil Tavar, SSG Rashid On. She read those 4 names and read them again. She had known from the notebook's first page that there were 4 soldiers, had known they had died in circumstances connected to falsified equipment data, but the notebook had given her the fact. The letter gave her the names, and the names were a different thing entirely from the fact, because names are not a category. They are specific men who had specific lives, and who had trusted that the things they carried had been certified honestly by people whose job was to certify things honestly, who had died in the gap between what they had been told and what was true. She was sitting on the floor of the container with her back against the rear wall and her red light aimed at the letter. She did not allow herself to stop reading. The laboratory results, the independent analysis, conducted by a retired Army ballistics engineer under private contract, whose name and credentials Welk had documented in the letter itself. The chain of custody Welk had established for the samples, the lab results, and the documentation linking the independent findings to the MT7 batch records in the federal procurement system. At the bottom of the 4th page, in smaller script, the name and contact method for the DIA officer she should reach. Vest Towen, a field-grade authentication phrase below it. And below that, one more note. On the drive, everything from the communication chain on the contract award side. What they said to each other when they believed no one was keeping records. It is enough. Get it out of here. She folded the letter. She held it with both hands against the floor for a moment. She thought about Parn Welk driving to this reserve 11 days before his death and spending 6 hours in this room. She thought about what he had known when he walked out the door and what he had done with the time between that afternoon and the morning that ended the knowing. She put the letter inside her jacket, against the notebook. She felt both of them there together, the older pages and the newer ones, the instruction and the evidence. She put the data drive in her left cargo pocket. She replaced the floor panel. She restored the recess. She stood and moved to the door and stepped over the monofilament at the exact angle and height she had memorized and pulled the door closed behind her and heard the cipher lock re-engage in the dark. She stood outside in the cold and breathed out slowly. She had it. The hide was 430 meters away. She covered it in 11 minutes, moving through the drainage cut and along the eastern edge of Tower Alpha's shadow. She saw the marker when she was still 40 meters from the hide's entrance. A small piece of orange safety tape, the kind used to mark range hazards, tied to the stake at the hide's entrance position, at the precise mark she used as her reference point for entry angle in low light. She had not placed it there. She stopped where she was for a full 30 seconds. He had known where the entrance was. She approached at a slow angle, scanning, moving carefully. No additional thermal signatures in the area. The camp was 400 meters away, and all 5 signatures were in positions she had been tracking through the night. She reached the hide entrance and found, pressed beneath the orange tape, a small card in a waterproof sleeve. She pulled it free. She turned on her red-filtered light and held it close. Grease pencil, military block script, controlled and deliberate. Stand down, WYNE. The container cannot help you. I was ATKHOST. I was not the one giving orders. Do not make this cost more than it already has. CRAMM. She read it 3 times. He had known she went to Bunker C. He had watched the monofilament trigger from a distance and had made no move to intercept her or alert the team. He had come to her hide instead, in the dark, at the entrance of a position she had believed concealed, and he had left a message rather than a response. He was at coast. He was not the one giving orders. He was warning her, in the language of someone who understood the same operational calculus she did, that whatever she had retrieved from the container was not going to be enough against the people who had sent him here to destroy it. She put the card in her jacket beside the letter and the notebook. 3 items now, against her chest. She checked the M2010. She looked north toward the mountains. She thought about SFC Devon Mace and SSG Lyle Crown and SFC Emil Tavar and SSG Rashidon, and she thought about what it meant that a professional of Hobe Cram's experience had come to her hide in the dark to warn her rather than to stop her. Someone above him had sent him here. He had followed those orders the same way she had followed orders at a checkpoint in Coast in 2022, and whatever that had cost him, it had cost him enough that he was standing at the entrance of her hide at 300 in the Montana cold leaving a message instead of pulling a trigger. That was information. Whatever Cram knew about the power of the people above him, he did not know what she had just read. He had not read the 4 names at the bottom of the 3rd page. He did not know what she was going to carry out of this range. He had given her a warning. Night 4 was going to be different. She did not sleep before the 4th night. There was no reason to sleep and no capacity for it, and she had learned long ago that forcing sleep before a final action was a form of self-deception, a way of telling yourself the body needed rest when what it actually needed was to stay honest about what was coming. She lay in the hide with her back against the frozen earth, and the data drive in her left jacket pocket, and the letter from Parnwelk pressed against her ribs, and she counted the stars until she stopped counting and simply looked at them. The camp 400 meters to the northwest had been quiet for most of the past 2 hours. She had kept intermittent observation on it throughout the night and had seen nothing unusual. Glenn Vetch and Dwell Prynne were on alternating watch rotations, which was correct procedure, and which told her that Cram had not abandoned discipline even as the situation had compressed around him over 3 consecutive nights. That, too, was information. A man who holds his team to procedure when the pressure is greatest is either very confident or has no other available option, and with Hobe Cram she had come to understand it was probably both. Set Rain had been awake since 1:30. She could see him through the thermal scope, sitting at the edge of his sleeping position, facing the mountains, not moving, not sleeping, not on watch, just sitting with whatever Set Rain sat with when the arithmetic had run its full course and landed somewhere he had not intended. Torhen was asleep. She had checked 3 times in the past hour, and his signature was the soft, lower-temperature bloom of genuine sleep, rather than the controlled suppression of someone lying still while remaining alert. He was 22 years old and he had been awake for most of 48 hours, and his body had finally overridden whatever kept it from resting. She thought about what that meant, a 22-year-old in a situation like this, sleeping. Not the sleep of someone without conscience, the sleep of someone who has made a decision. She put the scope down and looked up at the sky and thought about Parnwelk's letter, and the 4 names at the end of the 3rd page, and she waited for first dark. At 1 hour past midnight she began. She started with Lane 1 and Lane 6 together, the outermost lanes of the reserve, activating both cable systems from the junction boxes she had accessed on the first night, so that the initial sounds came from the widest possible separation. Not from a point source, from the edges of the entire range simultaneously, as if the perimeter itself had come to life. She moved to Lane 2 and Lane 5 within 90 seconds of the first activation, then 3 and 4, all 6 lanes running. 24 steel target plates moving on 6 cables in the dark, the pulley housing singing a low metallic tone in the cold air, the plates shifting and swinging and producing in the darkness, a sound that was not any single identifiable thing, but was instead the accumulation of many movements at once, a distributed, sourceless noise that surrounded the camp on 3 sides and came from no direction that could be covered by 5 men in any defensible arrangement. She had placed the last 2 infrared sensors during the previous evening, positioned to complete the arc around the camp's northern exposure. 8 sensors now, each pulsing in the frequency range that turned the periphery of a night vision field into a space where shapes appeared and vanished without explanation. Not hallucination, not malfunction. Something more precisely disturbing than either, because a malfunction can be diagnosed and a hallucination can be dismissed, but a phenomenon that is consistent and repeatable and still cannot be located is the kind of thing that exhausts the analytical mind until the analytical mind begins to make errors. She did not watch from a single position. She moved between 3 observation points in a rotation she had established over the preceding nights, spending no more than 12 minutes at any one before shifting to the next. Movement was risk, but static observation was its own vulnerability, and she had weighed those considerations against each other over 3 days and had settled on rotation as the better discipline for the final night. She was at her second position, 130 meters northeast of the camp, when the argument began. She could see both men clearly in the thermal scope. Set Rain had risen from his position at the edge of the camp and moved to the center, and Cram had turned to face him, and what she observed in the next 4 minutes was unlike anything she had watched in the preceding 3 nights. The previous exchanges between them had been controlled, professional, the disagreements of 2 men who were on the same side of a problem even when they disagreed about how to address it. This was not that. Rain's posture in the thermal scope was squared and forward-leaning in a way she had not seen before, both hands visible and not moving, his head level, his stance without the slight concession that had characterized his previous approaches. He was not making a case. He was not persuading. He was telling. The particular body language of a man who has moved past the point where he is asking permission for his position and has arrived at the point where he is simply stating it. She watched Cram's response. He did not argue back. He did not gesture. He raised his right hand, and in the thermal scope she saw the shape that his right hand held was no longer empty. She held her breath. The raised weapon was not pointed. It was elevated, held across the body in a position that communicated intent without yet expressing it. The position that means I have considered this option, and I am prepared to use it, and what you say in the next moment will determine whether I do. She had been on both ends of that position in her career, and she understood exactly what it communicated and what it required of the person on the receiving end. Rain went still. Not afraid. She could tell the difference at this distance, even in thermal. Afraid men shift their weight backward. Rain's weight did not shift. He stood exactly as he had been standing, squared and level, and absorbed the information of the raised weapon with the composure of someone who had already accepted the full range of possible outcomes before he chose to stand up and walk to the center of the camp. The 2 men held that tableau for 11 seconds. Then Rain turned and walked back to his position. Slowly, deliberately, the walk of a man who was choosing the pace of his own departure and was making that choice visible. Cram lowered the weapon. He turned back toward the range, toward the noise that was surrounding them from all directions, toward the darkness and the cable sounds and the infrared interference and everything she had spent 3 nights building around them. He stood there. He was alone in that moment, in a way she had not seen him be alone in 3 nights of watching. The posture was different. The shoulders carried something that the previous nights had not required of them yet. She looked at it for a long moment and named it accurately. He had made the choice he had come here to make, and he was standing at the edge of having completed it. And whatever he had told himself about that choice before he made, it was not holding up the way he had needed it to hold up. She moved to her 3rd position. The 4th signal came at 3:09 in the morning, and she almost missed it because she was moving between positions and had her attention on the ground in front of her rather than on the camp. She caught the thermal bloom at the periphery of her field of view, a figure, separated from the main camp, moving northeast, not moving quickly, moving carefully, with deliberate slowness, in the specific way that communicates visible intent to anyone who might be watching. Moving toward her. She stopped where she was. She raised the M2010 and found the figure in the thermal scope and held it there. One man, smaller than Cram, lighter heat signature than either Vetch or Prin, moving with both hands away from his body, slightly elevated, the gesture that is universal in its meaning and requires no translation across any cultural or professional boundary. Torhen. He was walking straight toward the observation position she had used most frequently. Not her current position. The position she had been at most often over the course of the 3 nights, which meant he had been watching her watching him, and had identified the pattern she had not intended to make visible. 22 years old. She held very still and let him come. He stopped at 30 meters from the tower base. He stood in the dark with his hands elevated and did not move for a long moment. Then he said something, not loudly, at the volume of someone who understands the person they are addressing is close enough to hear a conversational tone. "My name is Torhen," he said. "I don't have a weapon in my hands. I'm not going to move toward you unless you tell me to." He paused. The cold air made his breath visible, small clouds that dissipated in the dark. "I know you're there. You've been using the tower line for most of the night. The thermal scatter off the cable housing reads differently when there's a person behind it." She did not respond. He waited. He did not lower his hands. He did not shift his weight. Whatever this was, he had decided on it before he left the camp, and he was prepared to stand in the dark and the cold and wait for as long as the situation required. "Hobe Cram is my stepfather," he said. "He brought me into this. I didn't know what it was until we were already inside the fence." Another pause. "I've been recording since the first night. I have a device in my left chest pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly. I want you to see what I have." She watched him reach for it. She watched his right hand move to the left side of his jacket and withdraw a small device he held outward toward the tower at arm's length, separate from his body and clearly visible. It was an action camera, the size of a cigarette lighter, with a lens no larger than a pencil eraser, the kind of device used for firearms qualification and range documentation. He had told the others on the first morning that he was wearing it to document post-mission range conditions. Cram had not questioned it. There is a particular blindness that comes from trusting someone absolutely, and Hobe Cram had trusted his stepson. 3 nights, Tor said. Everything. Every transmission, every conversation between Cram and the outside contact, every order, every name, including the name of the person who contracted this operation. He held the device steady, His arm did not waver. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to take this." She came out of the shadow of the tower support. She moved to where he was standing in 4 seconds. In the direct and unambiguous way she moved when she had decided to do something. And she stopped 2 meters from him and looked at him in the dark. He was younger than she had expected him to appear at close distance. He was cold, and he had been awake for too long. And there was something in his face that she had seen before in the faces of people who had carried something that did not belong to them, and had finally found the person they had been looking for to give it to. She took the device. "Why?" she said. He lowered his arms. He breathed once, long and controlled. "Because he told me it was a records extraction, classified documents that belonged to a private contractor. He said no one would be hurt. He said we'd be in and out in 4 hours. He looked at the device in her hand. "He didn't tell me about the 4 soldiers. I read it on his tablet on the second night when he was sleeping." He met her eyes. "I've known their names for 36 hours. I needed to do something with that." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the device. She put it in her right jacket pocket beside the letter. "Stay here," she said. "Do not move from this position. Do not contact anyone." He nodded. She moved back into the dark. Veston came in from the south access at first gray light, 43 minutes before sunrise, exactly as she had said she would. She came with 2 additional agents whose names Orla did not ask for, and she came with the paperwork already completed and the authority already established, and she came with the particular composure of someone who had been waiting for this specific morning for longer than the 48 hours since Orla's call. She was a compact woman in her late 30s, with short hair going slightly gray at the temples, and the measured physical efficiency of someone who had spent a career operating in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. She looked at Orla the way professionals look at each other when they are meeting for the first time after operating toward the same point from different directions. Assessment without judgment. Recognition without assumption. "Drive," she said. Orla gave it to her. Tawn turned it over in her hand. She did not open it. She put it in her own jacket pocket. She looked at the camp 200 meters to the northwest, and at the figures visible at its edge, and at the tent that was still collapsed on the ground from the shot 3 nights ago. "Recording device," Orla said. She gave Tawn the camera Torhen had handed her. Tawn held both items. "How many are mobile?" 4. The youngest is at the tower base north side. He's cooperating." She paused. "One more thing." She took the envelope from her jacket and held it. "This is from Welk. Original handwriting dated 11 days before his death. Chain of custody is intact. The lab results are inside." She looked at Tawn steadily. "He knew he was going to die for this. He knew, and he did it anyway. I need you to understand that before you put it in a case file." Tawn took the envelope. She held it for a moment with both hands before she placed it carefully in the interior pocket of her jacket. "I know what he was," she said. "I've known Parn Welk for 16 years." She paused. "Knew." They did not speak after that for a moment. There was nothing to add to it that would have been an improvement on the silence. Then Tawn lifted her chin toward the camp. "Walk me through who's where." The arrests took 22 minutes. Set Rain came forward without resistance. He came forward, in fact, before Tawn's team had reached him, walking out of the camp with his hands visible and his weapon secured, and his face expressing the particular quality of a man arriving at an outcome he had accepted several hours earlier and was relieved, in some complicated way, to finally reach. He did not speak during the process. He sat where he was told to sit and he waited. Glenn Vetch and Dwell Prynne were taken at their watch positions on opposite sides of the camp perimeter. Neither of them offered resistance. Prynne set his weapon down on the ground before the agent reached him, the deliberate and visible gesture of someone who had done the calculation quickly and arrived at the correct answer. Tor Hen was at the tower base where Orla had told him to stay. Tawn went to him personally. She crouched beside him in the cold and spoke quietly for several minutes. Orla watched from a distance and did not approach. Whatever was said between them was not for her to be part of. What she saw, from where she stood, was a young man who had not slept for 2 days and who had done something that had cost him something she would not know the full measure of. She turned away and gave him that. Hobe Cram was not at the camp when they reached it. She had not expected him to be. She had known since 3:09 in the morning, the moment Tor Hen walked away from the camp with his hands up, that Cram would have seen it. She had known since the previous night, when she watched him raise a weapon at set range, that he understood the shape of what was closing around him. She had been tracking the secondary thermal signature on the east perimeter of the reserve since 4:41 in the morning, when a heat bloom distinct from the range equipment had appeared at the Lane 1 marker and had been moving steadily southeast toward the reserve's eastern boundary and the fire road beyond it. She had let him go that far because she had needed the arrests completed first. She had let him go that far because the distance to the fire road from her current position, accounting for the route he was taking, and the pace he was maintaining in cold weather over frozen ground, put him at the extraction vehicle at approximately the same time she needed him to be there. She broke from the camp at a run, not the controlled movement of the previous 3 nights, an actual run, with the M2010 across her back and the frozen ground hard under her boots, and the pale light coming in from the east making the world visible in that particular way of very early morning, when colors have not yet returned to things, and everything exists in gray and white, and the particular blue of recent darkness. She had covered 900 meters in this reserve at night before. She had never covered it at a run. She had 8 minutes. She ran. The eastern boundary of the Gallatin Precision Combat Reserve was marked by a double row of steel posts sunk into the frozen ground, with a service gate on the fire road that was padlocked from the inside. Locked from the inside, which meant the person who had the key to the gate could exit without using the main access, could exit through the fire road that ran southeast along the ridge and connected to the county highway 4 miles down. There was a vehicle on the fire road. She could not see it yet. She could see the glow of its parking lights from her current position, which was on the elevated ground above the Lane 1 terminus, and she could see the gate, which was open, and she could see the thermal signature of one man loading something into the rear of the vehicle with the purposeful speed of someone who has already decided where he is going and is in the process of making it happen. She stopped. She settled onto one knee and brought the M2010 up and found the vehicle in the scope. A dark truck, the kind that existed in sufficient numbers in Montana to not be remarkable, with a magnetic panel on the driver's side door that could be removed or replaced to change its appearance in under 30 seconds. She could see Cram at the rear. She could see him close the tailgate. She could see him move toward the driver's door. She ranged the vehicle. 920 meters. She accounted for the crosswind, which had shifted from its overnight direction, and was now coming from due west at an estimated 8 miles per hour. She accounted for the downhill angle of the shot, approximately 3 degrees. She accounted for the cold, which she had been accounting for over 3 nights of lying in it, and which she understood at a level that went beyond calculation into the particular knowledge of someone who has been immersed in a condition long enough to read it directly. She did not aim at Hobe Cram. She aimed at the engine block. The front of the vehicle was pointed southeast, which put the engine compartment at roughly a 30-degree angle to her shooting line. She adjusted for the penetration angle through the hood, estimated the displacement of the engine block center mass from the vehicle's forward point, and settled the reticle at the position, where a .300 Win mag at this distance, and in these conditions would enter the hood and strike the block rather than passing through into the passenger compartment. She breathed out. The trigger broke clean. 920 meters away, the vehicle lurched forward 2 feet and stopped. Steam rose from the hood in a white column visible even at this distance in the pale early light. The engine had not seized. It had simply stopped being capable of moving the vehicle forward, which was sufficient. Cram stepped out of the driver's door. He stood beside the vehicle and looked back up the ridge toward the range. He could not see her from that distance, in the available light, against the terrain she was positioned against. But he looked in her direction the way he had been looking in her direction since the first night, with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize over 3 days as something other than tactical assessment. He raised his right hand, not a weapon, his hand, palm forward. She held that image without completing the analysis. She did not have enough information yet. She maintained her position until Tawn's vehicle appeared on the fire road from the south access 4 minutes later and pulled up behind the disabled truck. She watched through the scope as Vest Tawn stepped out and approached Hobe Cram. She watched him turn toward Tawn. She watched him look at the DIA identification she held out. She watched him nod slowly, once, in the manner of a man receiving information he expected to receive. He put his hands behind his back without being told to. She lowered the M2010 and sat on the frozen ground above Lane 1 and let the weight of the morning settle around her. The briefing from Tawn came at noon, in the range control building that was the only heated structure on the reserve. Orla sat across a folding table from the DIA agent and 2 federal attorneys who had arrived with Tawn's team, and who carried the documents that would begin the process of converting what Parn Welk had built in Bunker C into something a federal court could use. Tawn talked for 40 minutes. She listened. The company was called Crestline Holdings. It was a defense and logistics management corporation with contracts across 11 federal agencies, publicly traded, headquartered in Virginia, with a board of directors that included the names of 4 former flag officers and 1 former deputy secretary of defense. Meridian Ridge Systems was one of its subsidiaries, the one responsible for precision ammunition manufacturing under the federal contract that had produced the MT-7 batch. The senator was Grant Talford, Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Readiness, which was the subcommittee that oversaw ammunition procurement standards and certification. He had been on that subcommittee for 11 years. He had received contributions totaling $900,000 from Crestline Holdings and its affiliated entities over the course of those 11 years, distributed across the campaign finance instruments that made the direct connection traceable but not straightforward. Hobe Cram had been a contracted operational asset for Crestline Holdings for 11 of those same years. Tawn set down the folder she had been reading from and looked at Orla directly. "Talford is going to fight this," she said. "He has the resources to fight it for a long time. The letter and the laboratory results establish what happened, who was responsible, and that Welk understood exactly what he was documenting. But they would not be sufficient on their own to survive what Talford will throw at them. His attorneys would characterize them as the motivated testimony of a senior officer who had built a private case in isolation. That argument is well funded and well practiced." She paused. "What removes that argument entirely is what else Welk built." "The test data," Orla said. "He reran the MT-7 batch 11 days before he died. At this range, on this equipment, in winter atmospheric conditions he documented in 3 pages of meteorological notes, 1,100 meters. The drop variance was 47 centimeters below predicted point of impact." Tawn placed the letter on the table between them, setting her hand briefly on it before continuing. "He ran it 40 times. He fired 40 rounds from the MT7 batch. He recorded every data point. He signed the summary with his full name, his certification number, and the date. Orla did not speak. "That test is not testimony," Tolan said. "It is a forensic reconstruction. Under federal evidentiary standards, it establishes with documented physical evidence what the actual performance characteristics of the MT7 batch were under operational conditions comparable to Helmand Province. It is independent of his personal belief or grievance. It is a reproducible scientific record that any qualified ballistics engineer in this country can examine and verify. It connects directly to the 4 engagement reports from 2018 and 2019 that Welk identified. It establishes that the certified test results submitted by Meridian Ridge Systems were not results from tests conducted at this facility or under the applicable field conditions. And it establishes that Parn Welk had the professional expertise, the documented access, and the independent methodology to make that determination in a manner that cannot be argued away. She paused. "It establishes," she said quietly, "that 4 men died in conditions where they should not have died, using equipment that was not performing the way they had been certified it would perform, and that the people responsible for that certification knew or had reason to know the certification was false." Orla said nothing for a long time. Outside the control building, through the single window that faced north, she could see Lane 4 of the range. She could see the cable housing at the near end of the lane and the steel target plate at the far end, small at this distance, barely visible against the white of the ground. Parn Welk had run his last test on Lane 4. He had written it in his notes. The lane he had used for his own qualification test 31 years ago, when he had come to this facility as a young officer, and had spent a week in November shooting at distances that had not yet been routine, and had qualified, and had come back to this range 4 times in his career, and always used Lane 4 because some habits are not really habits but are a kind of loyalty. "What happens to Torhen?" she said. Tolan's expression did not change, but something in it adjusted. He cooperated fully. He initiated cooperation independently. The recording he provided contains material that substantially advances the evidentiary case against Cram and Talford both. He was recruited by a family member under false pretenses. She folded her hands on the table. "He is 22 years old. The attorneys will work with what he did rather than against it." Orla nodded once. "And Cram? He said something to you in the card he left." Tolan looked at the table. "That he was at Coast, that he was not the one giving orders." "He did." "That claim is consistent with what the recording device contains." Tolan reached into her jacket pocket and placed a single sheet of notes on the table. Night 2 of this operation, the camera captured a communication between Cram and his outside contact. He names a Crestline Holdings civilian liaison, a man named Weiss, who had operated inside Talford's subcommittee structure for 9 years. Weiss is the channel through which the Coast stand-down reached your earpiece. He routed it through military command authority that Talford's subcommittee position gave him access to. Cram received that order the same way you did, as a legitimate command directive. She looked at Orla. He followed it. What you did with it is the difference between the two of you. Orla looked at the window, at Lane 4. "What Hobe Cram is and is not responsible for is going to take longer than this morning to determine," Tolan continued. "It is going to take a process that is considerably less satisfying than this conversation. That is the nature of the process. It is still the right process." Orla looked out the window at Lane 4. She thought about what the right process meant for SFC Devon Mace and SSG Lyle Crown and SFC Emil Tavar and SSG Rashid On, all of whom had gone through a process too. The process of trusting that the equipment they carried had been certified honestly by people whose job it was to certify things honestly, and who had died in the gap between what they had been told and what was true. "I know," she said. She went to Lane 4 that afternoon. The sun was low and the light was thin, and the range was empty of everyone except her. Tolan's vehicles had gone. The federal attorneys had gone. The camp in the northwest quadrant had been photographed and documented, and its materials removed in evidence containers. The only remaining evidence that 5 men had been on this range was a rectangle of compressed snow where the camp had stood, and the cut section of fence at the eastern boundary that maintenance would close before spring. She walked Lane 4 from the near end to the far end, 980 meters. She walked it at the pace she had been trained to walk ground she was assessing, not slow but attentive, her eyes reading the surface the way Parnwelk had read surfaces, the way he had taught her to read them, looking for what the ground knew that the maps did not say. At the 850-meter mark, she found what she had known she would find if she looked. The ground here was compressed in the small, specific pattern of a man who had been prone for an extended period. Not recent. The pattern was weeks old, maybe 2 months. The compression settled under subsequent snowfall and partially obscured but not invisible to someone who was looking for it. Beside the compressed ground was a small disturbance in the snow that might have been anything, but that she understood to be the position where a spotting scope had been rested on a tripod. Parnwelk had lain here. He had lain here and fired 40 rounds of the MT7 batch at the target plate at the Lane terminus, 1,100 meters distant, and he had recorded every result. And he had done this 11 days before a form of dying that left no trace. And he had done it knowing it might be what killed him, because someone would notice the access log, and he had not tried to hide the access log. She crouched beside the compressed ground and stayed there for a while. She thought about a man who had been meticulous in everything he did, and who had decided that the last meticulous thing he would do would be to come to a range in the mountains of Montana in November and fire 40 rounds of ammunition into a target he could barely see and write down every data point as it landed, in the cold, alone, knowing that the data would not help him and would only matter to the people who came after. She had asked him once, years before, what he believed accountability meant in practical terms, not in the abstract, in practice, what it actually required of a person. He had thought about it for a moment in the way he thought about things that he took seriously, and then he had said that accountability meant not being able to stop thinking about something until you had done the one thing that needed doing. He had said it was not more complicated than that. He had said the difficulty was not in understanding what accountability required. The difficulty was in doing it regardless of the cost. She reached into the snow beside the compressed ground, and her fingers found something. A small piece of laminated card, the size of a field data card, pressed into the snow under a flat stone at the edge of the compressed area. She turned it over. Parnwelk's handwriting, the backward slanting script she had known for 6 years, 3 words and a period. For the 4. She held it in the cold for a long time. She turned her face away from the lane and looked at the mountains and let what she was feeling be what it was without trying to name it more precisely than it could be named. She was not sure how long she stayed that way. When she stood, she put the card in the pocket where she had been keeping the notebook, against her chest, with the other things she was going to carry from this place. She walked back down Lane 4 toward the range control building, and the light was going and the cold was deepening, and the mountains above the Gallatin Range were moving from gray into the blue-black that preceded full dark, and the reserve was exactly as quiet as it was every night, the cable housings ticking slightly in the wind, the structures settling into the cold the way old structures do. She was almost to the control building when the satellite phone vibrated. She stopped. Unknown number. The screen showed only the digits, no identification. She looked at it for a moment before she answered. The message was not a call. It was a text, which meant it had been composed in advance and sent to arrive at a time calculated for effect. 3 lines. Talford has 2 more sites. You are the only one who knows the terrain. The drive is not the end of it. She read it twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked north, toward the dark outline of the peaks against the sky, which were the same peaks she had looked at every evening for 4 years from this range, which were the same peaks that had been there before this reserve existed, and would be there after everything she had done here was resolved or forgotten or both. She did not respond to the message. She went inside. She sat at the table in the range control building and set the M2010 on the surface in front of her, not stored, not broken down, just resting there in the way a tool rests when it has done what it was made to do and is waiting to find out whether it is finished. She took out the laminated card from her pocket and set it beside the rifle. For the 4. She looked at both of them for a moment, the rifle and the card, the thing she had carried here and the thing she had found here, the work that had been done and the work that had not yet been named. The phone in her pocket was silent. Outside, the range was dark and still, and the cables on all 6 lanes were quiet, the target plates at rest, the mechanism at rest, everything at rest the way things are at rest when the immediate need has passed, and what remains is the decision about what comes next. She did not make that decision tonight. Tonight she sat in the heated building in the mountains of Montana and thought about Parn Welk, and about the 4 men whose names were on the last page of his letter, and about the morning that was going to come after this night, the way mornings came after all nights, whether or not anyone was ready for it. She was going to be ready. She had been trained for ready. She picked up the card one more time and read the 3 words in his handwriting, and then set it down again carefully, the same way he had set it down in the snow beside his shooting position in November, in the specific and deliberate way of a man placing something exactly where it needs to be. Then she waited for the morning.